Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Larry Lewis, and welcome to our webinar series, Anatomy of a Data Breach, What to Do When the Unthinkable Occurs. I'm the event producer for the series, and the first thing I'd like to do is welcome you all today and thank you for being here. I'd also like to say thank you to the Texas Dental Association and TDA Perks, Josh and Donovan and the whole crew over there for helping to promote the event and making all this information accessible for you to make sure that you're compliant as the omnibus rule rolls around in September. We have a very nice presenter, a great presenter today, Christine Marciano. Our moderator will be Smart Training's Jim Moore, National HIPAA Consultant. And before we get rolling, there's a couple of items that we'd like to take care of. If you give me just a moment. Going to give folks, there's still a few folks arriving. I'm going to give everybody another minute or so. Okay, I think folks have gotten themselves set up. Jim, if you want to take things away, I'll take care of these poll questions a little further down the line.
Great, Larry, and thanks. And good afternoon again, everyone. From all of us at Smart Training, we certainly appreciate you taking your lunch hour to be with us as we listen to Christine Marciano. She is president of Cyber Data Risk Managers, an independent insurance agency that specializes in data privacy, cyber liability risk, D&C insurance, and intellectual property protection. Christine brings to bear 17 years of experience in working in various roles within the insurance and financial services industry. She's held positions at CIBC Oppenheimer, AXA Advisors, and at Allstate Insurance Company, so she's certainly well qualified to speak today on avoiding problems through risk assessment. She'll also talk about proactive actions your practice can take today and what to do in the event the unthinkable happens, in the event you have to deal with a data breach or a security incident. So it's my pleasure to introduce Christine Marciano. Christine?
Thanks, Jim. Okay, I'm happy to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me get started here. Just bear with me for a moment. This afternoon we're going to be discussing part 2 of Anatomy of a Data Breach, what to do when the unthinkable occurs. And as a dentist, you know that cavities happen. Proper dental hygiene minimizes the chances of a cavity from happening. And as a dentist, you offer your patients a solution to responding to cavities, but how will you respond if your patient files are stolen? That's going to be the discussion here. Today, it's really no longer a matter of if a data breach can happen. It's really a question of when. Benjamin Franklin was quoted as saying, "In this world, nothing is certain but death and taxes." I think that more than it's said that 138 million American adults have life insurance, and the reason is because death is only one of the guarantees in life, that and taxes, and now perhaps maybe we can add a data breach to that list. As we're seeing in the news, they just continue to happen, and they don't seem to be going away. HIPAA violations can be very costly. Some recent fines that have been out in the news were with the University of Idaho and Weld Point. University of Idaho had incurred a $400,000 fine. The breach was caused by a disabled server firewall that occurred over a 10-month period. So this wasn't even something that a hacker broke into the network. It was just something that they didn't have the firewall active, and they were hit with that $400,000 fine, which resulted in a breach of close to 18,000 patients. And then Weld Point was hit with a $1.7 million fine. That breach was caused due to a weakness in an online application that left a little bit over 600,000 people's names, birth dates, addresses, phone numbers, social security numbers, and health information exposed online for a period of 2 years. So it just goes to show that the human health services are really out there conducting their audits, and they're looking at these closely. And these were over a 10-month period and a 2-year period. But just look at these fines, $400,000 and $1.7 million. They could be really significant. There's just a lag here on my screen. Just bear with me for a moment. Okay, some recent data breaches that have been in the news. Earlier this week, there was a report of 32,000 patient records that were exposed on a contractor's unsecured website. This, again, was another breach due to a disabled firewall. This was only a shorter breach, but occurred over a 1-month period. It would be interesting to follow this breach to see if they're actually going to be hit with a similar fine as we saw with the University of Idaho due to their disabled firewall. And then there was a breach over at the major eye care group in Northern California. And that breach was caused by the theft of an unencrypted laptop. And I included this breach, while it's a little dated from earlier this year. I just wanted to show that this was due to a dental center data breach that was caused by the theft of 3 laptops. Okay, so why do you need to protect your patient-sensitive data? These findings here were conducted through Pronoman and Symantec. They had conducted a cost of data breach study, and they showed that respondents cited that the average cost of a U.S. data breach was $5.4 million, and that the average cost of a compromised record is roughly about $188. And the top cause of the respondents who participated in that study stated that the breaches were due to malicious or criminal attacks rather than negligence or system glitches. Okay, so here, it's in order to show the significance of the Human Healthcare Services penalty, the maximum penalty per violation due to negligence would be $1.5 million. That would be the maximum that your practice could actually potentially face if there was a violation of HIPAA and you had your patient data exposed. The top 3 causes of a data breach, according to Poneman and Symantec, were not only the top breach being the malicious or criminal attack, but also human error. I think as a dental practice, it might be kind of hard to imagine someone actually hacking into your network and having your data exposed, but I think we can all imagine how human error can actually happen on a daily basis. If your staff accidentally leaves a file out and it's seen by someone else, or loses a laptop, I think we can definitely imagine things sort of due to accidental or negligent or failure to act nature versus trying to imagine a malicious or criminal attack. So here, in this study, human error was the top, the second cause of a data breach. Third, following the system glitch. The data breach notification final rule was recently amended when the omnibus final rule was introduced earlier this year, and the requirement has changed to the breach's risk of compromise rather than harm. They consider compromise to be more an objective test than harm. So data breach notification is necessary now in all situations except those in which your practice or a business associate demonstrates a low probability that PHI has been compromised. So basically when a data breach happens, for the most part, you're going to have to notify HHS that it's happened unless you can show that there's been low probability that PHI data was actually compromised. I'm having a little lag here on the slides. Apologize. Okay, so determining a data breach's risk of compromise. To determine whether there is a low probability that PHI has been compromised, your practice or business associate must conduct a risk assessment that considers the following factors. You would consider the nature and extent of the PHI involved, including the types of identifiers and the likelihood of re-identification, whether or not the unauthorized person who used the PHI or to whom the disclosure was made, as well as whether the PHI was actually acquired or viewed, and also to the extent to which the risk to the PHI has been mitigated. So these are all the steps that you're definitely going to want to look at and assess when there's been a breach to determine whether or not there's a risk of compromise. And if you determine that there's no chance that anyone actually could take that data and do anything with it, make sure you document it, because there's still a chance that later on they're going to come back and you really need to show why you did not report the data breach and why you didn't send out the notifications. So this, I'm thinking that a lot of organizations are going to look at this and they really need to examine this and may decide to just go ahead and notify, because either way you're still going to have to go through the risk assessment. And now risk assessment is required under the HIPAA security rule, and it's the assessment of the risks and vulnerabilities that could negatively impact the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of electronic protected health information, also known as ePHI, held by your practice, and the likelihood of occurrence, as we just kind of looked at a little bit. And the risk analysis is going to be the first step in your security rule compliance efforts. Some risk analysis considerations. Risk analysis includes taking inventory of all your systems and applications that are going to be used to access and house the data, and classifying them by level of risk. And the thorough and accurate risk analysis would consider all relevant losses that would be expected if security measures were not in place, including loss or damage to your electronic personal health information data, corrupted data systems, and anticipated ramifications of such losses or damage. And your organization's risk analysis should take into account all of its PHI, regardless whether it's held in electronic medium, if it's how it's received, maintained, or transmitted, and even taking a look at source and location, where it's sitting on your network, and whether it's sitting in your smartphone, your laptop, all that needs to be considered in the risk analysis. Okay, so don't forget, when you're conducting a risk analysis and you're implementing all your policies and procedures, the documentation is truly key. That's really when a compliance audit and the OCR is coming into your office and asking to look at your files. You're going to want to make sure that you've documented every step of your risk analysis. There's no specific format required, but just remember, documentation could be your best friend. It's truly key. And periodically, you're going to need to make sure that you're reviewing your risk analysis as needed. And you want to remember that the risks come from vulnerabilities, as we're going to look at the next slide. So you're really going to want to learn what your vulnerabilities are as it pertains to your patient health information.
Christine?
Yes.
If you could just adjust your headphones just a little bit. We're getting a little bit of static when you're talking.
Okay, I'm sorry. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay. 3 important definitions that you're going to want to understand when conducting a risk analysis are going to be based around vulnerabilities, threats, and risks. So vulnerability is a flaw or weakness in system security procedures in your design, implementation, or internal controls that could be exercised, which is accidentally triggered or intentionally exploited as a result in a security breach or a violation of your system security policy. And a threat is the potential for a staff, a member of your staff, or something else to exercise a specific vulnerability, whether it's accidentally triggered or intentionally exploited. And the risk is a net mission impact, considering the probability that a particular threat will actually happen, whether it's accidentally triggered or intentionally exploited, and a particular vulnerability, and the resulting impact of how this should occur. These are all definitions by NIST, and I'm actually going to give a little bit more detail in regards to these 3 definitions in the following 3 slides to really explain how vulnerabilities, whether accidentally triggered or intentionally exploited, could really be the trigger of your security incident. So that's why in the earlier slide I mentioned you really want to know and understand what your vulnerabilities are. And and how it pertains to the EPHI. And vulnerabilities can basically be grouped into two categories, technical and non-technical. Non-technical vulnerabilities include ineffective or non-existent policies, procedures, standards, or guidelines. So that's why we talk about, and as you probably heard, policies and procedures are key, as well as standards or guidelines. And so the HIPAA security role and the new omnibus role really target all of these. So you're going to want to make sure you have this in place. And technical vulnerabilities include holes, flaws, or weaknesses in the development of your information systems or incorrectly implemented.
Welcome to GoToWebinar, Web Events Made Easy.
Consideration. Okay, and I'm just having a lag in my screen here, so bear with me for a moment. Okay. Okay, so threats. There are several types of threats that may occur within an information system or operating environment. Threats can be grouped into general categories, such as natural, human, environmental. So we know that natural threats can include floods, earthquakes, tornadoes, and landslides. Human threats, which I think is something that we can definitely all imagine more so, are enabled by humans and may include intentional or unintentional actions. So again, if you remember one of the earlier slides, human error was one of the top 3 reasons of a data breach. And environmental can include power failures, pollution, chemicals, and liquid leakage. And risk. A vulnerability triggered or exploited by a threat equals a risk. So when you're conducting a risk analysis, vulnerabilities and threats are going to be something that are going to equal your risk. So that's why we need to consider what your vulnerabilities and threats actually are as they pertain to your personal health information of your patients. And a threat must have the capability to trigger or exploit a vulnerability to become a risk. Risk is a function of the likelihood of a given threat triggering or exploiting a particular vulnerability and resulting in the impact on your practice. This means that risk is not a single factor or event, but it's rather a combination of factors or events, which are the threats and vulnerabilities, that if they occur, may have an adverse impact on your practice. So basically since it triggers the risk, which is going to be the data breach, it's going to have an impact on your practice. So the next step in the process would be risk management. And risk management is the actual implementation of security measures to sufficiently reduce the risk of losing or compromising EPHI and to meet the general security standards. So let's visualize here. I think you know as a dentist how a cavity forms. But here, if you look at visualization that I've included here of a data breach, you have risk there in the middle, and you have vulnerabilities and threats targeting the risk, which then leads to the data breach. So it just gives you an idea that, as you know, proper dental hygiene can help minimize the cavity, and so can proper super hygiene and risk analysis can also help minimize the risks and chances of a data breach from happening. Well, as a dentist, you may be able to explain to your patients how to prevent and minimize the chances of a cavity. It kind of just helps show how you can kind of minimize the chances of a data breach. We can't prevent a data breach from happening, but we can definitely minimize the risks of vulnerabilities and threats that lead to the risk of chances of happening towards the data breach. So preventing cavities and data breaches, we all know that you have the EPHI data of your patients. So now what? The next steps you would want to take a look at after conducting a risk analysis, the first in the process would be train your staff. As we know, human error happens. You're going to want to make sure that they understand your policies and procedures, and assigning a privacy officer to create proper policies and procedures really would be key. So as a small practice, you may not have the capability to have a privacy officer doing that and that alone. Maybe you have someone on staff that could take over the responsibilities and be able to properly handle that, and also outsource your training to someone like Smart Training to handle the process if you're not able to handle this internally. And then you're going to want to take stock of your data. You'll want to identify the types of data collected. If it's anything besides personal health information, are you collecting credit cards, bank account information? You want to understand where and how is it collected. Are you collecting it digitally or on your iPad, or are you handing the iPad over to the patient when they walk in to collect that information? So you're going to want to just know exactly where and how it's collected, because that's very important, because those are really the open endpoints of how a data breach could actually happen. So you only want to collect the data that you need, and the data that's collected, you definitely want to make sure it's secured, and even go as far as encrypting it, and of course protect it. And then when you're no longer needing that patient data, you're going to want to make sure that you properly dispose of that data according to your retention schedule, and also have a security incident response procedure in place so that if a data breach happens, you know exactly what you need to do, and your staff needs to know what to do in that process as well. So here's some of the costs associated when a data breach happens. You're going to have attorney fees. You're going to have breach guidance, investigation, notification to your patients, litigation preparation, e-discovery pertains to how the breach actually happened. You're going to have defense, possibly if there's a lawsuit down the road due to your data breach. You could incur fines based on a federal, state level, and also, as we know, through HIPAA. And plaintiff demands, your patient demands, when a breach happens, they're going to expect to first understand how the breach happened, what have you done to stop it, but also by offering them credit monitoring insurance. It's become, for the most part, an industry standard when a data breach happens, where for the most part, seeing organizations offer this as a free service to the patients or consumers who had their data exposed. And then there could be some civil fines and penalties, as well as time for the patient who might actually have had a medical identity theft at that point. So it's going to take some time for them to call up and perhaps get their credit card replaced, call up the healthcare insurer, see if they can have their medical identification number changed. So it's going to be loss of time, so there's just going to be some of the patient demands there. And then response costs on your part for vendors, forensics investigator, notification providers, maybe hiring a public relations firm, and also an attorney. And call center would pertain to, after you've sent out the notification letters, there could be an expense to set up a call center so that your patients can call in and understand how the breach happened. Maybe you want to set up a call center so that they're calling the call center and not your office. You don't want to inundate your staff at that point after a breach has happened. So these are just some of the costs, and again, as well as ID theft and the credit monitoring piece falls under response costs as well. And the hidden costs of a data breach, it's really hard to quantify these costs here. Reputation damage is going to be one, financial loss, and also loss of patients. These are just the costs that are going to come later on, and it's just really hard to put a number on it, but it's just something to consider of how a data breach can actually have an impact on, one, the brand and reputation of your practice. It could cause financial loss. It can also cause your practice to lose your patients if they felt that you didn't do enough to protect their data, which then led to the data breach. So imagine your laptop containing unencrypted electronic personal health information was just stolen. What are you going to do now? Hopefully you'll have an incident response plan to be able to pull out. And if you don't have one, well, then utilizing data breach insurance as one component of an incident response plan could help. And that's what I do. My organization works with organizations like yours to be able to help put an incident response plan in place through the use of a data breach insurance policy. So every dental practice that collects and stores sensitive data should have a written incident response plan in place. Not only is it critical in a sense, but it's also a requirement by the omnibus rule. So data breach insurance offers help with managing the aftermath of a data breach and a security incident. It offers an incident response team. It's sort of a turnkey solution, so when a breach happens, you know you have a team or service providers in place to be able to call on through having a data breach coach, which is sort of a privacy attorney who's going to help you through the breach. You'll have access to a forensics investigator who will be hired, also known as a computer services expert, who's hired to determine how the breach happened, and number one, how the breach happened. Number two, to determine if the breach actually has to be reported, if any of the sensitive data was exposed. Then the privacy coach, the data breach coach, privacy attorney would get involved and work along with the forensics investigator. And the insurance also helps with discovery, reporting, and notifying those affected by the breach. And on the next screen, I'm going to go over the coverages that actually would come into play. Okay, well, first, utilizing data breach insurance helps manage and mitigate the risks associated with data breach. So good security is all about minimizing the risk and realizing what risk, which again ties back to the vulnerabilities and threats when you're going through your risk analysis, and then learning what you're still exposed to and monitoring where that risk may be exploited. So rule number one would be risk management solutions don't eliminate risk. They don't prevent them, but they can help minimize them to otherwise acceptable levels. And rule number two is insurance is fundamentally a transfer of identified risks. How can data breach insurance help after a security incident? Well, it minimizes the impact on your practice's reputational damage and your brand, and helps to mitigate penalties and response expenses, meaning that the insurance policy that we offer may, depending upon state law, might offer the ability to pay for your HIPAA fine. So if you were one of the unfortunate ones, say that we saw the University of Idaho earlier, and also WellPoint. University of Idaho had a $400,000 fine, and we saw WellPoint at $1.7 million. So depending on the insurance policy, first of all, that you're looking at, we may be able to offer coverage for HIPAA fines. So if you were unfortunate as the University of Idaho to have that $400,000 fine, there may be coverage for that under the insurance policy. Besides that, having coverage for penalties and response expenses, we also offer access to a data privacy attorney who's going to help navigate over 47 different state privacy laws that exist today. And the insurance is also going to help minimize the uncertainty of managing a comprehensive and effective response. And it may also act to save your practice from bankruptcy or liquidation in face of large regulatory penalties. So really the purpose of the insurance is to be meant to assist your practice after a data breach has happened. It's sort of a proactive step when you're putting your incident response plan in place to be able to have a turnkey solution that complements the response plan. And it also is a way to just be able to pick up the phone, call myself, and get the insurance company involved in the claim rather than handling it internally. Your staff is there and you're there to treat your patients. We're here to help you manage the aftermath of the data breach. And with the insurance, there's actually been some organizations who've incurred a data breach who actually didn't have the funds available or the ability to respond. So that's really what we talk about here for bankruptcy or liquidation. It's really the insurance could help small practices and practices of all sizes really be able to have a plan in place and the ability to respond, because as we saw in one of the studies in the earlier slides, the average data breach for a U.S. Organization could be as high as $5 million. And imagine if you had all the costs besides notification costs, paying that for out-of-pocket, then having to hire a privacy attorney, forensics investigator. The list just goes on and on of all the different team players that are involved in a breach. So really, the data breach insurance is a nice complement to your incident response plan because it just takes the stress off of you and your staff in responding. And it could also actually help you continue your practice and not be concerned about bankruptcy or having to close down the practice. And so some commonly offered data breach insurance coverages the typical framework of coverages offered within the policy. They're going to offer patient notification expenses. Once a data breach happens, you're going to need to report that data breach to not only human health services, but also you need to notify your patients. So the data breach insurance coverage will help create the letter. It will help mail out the piece and also offer the credit and identity monitoring to the patients as well.
Christine?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. There is a technical glitch going on with Citrix here, and it looks like our room is going to be shut down here and can't be extended. If we can wrap this up, we'll pick it up again next. We've got about 45 seconds, it appears.
Okay. Okay, just going to go quickly here. Okay, so privacy and security liability. We looked at the privacy coach. These are typical insurance costs of what the actual policy would cost. You see here $1,600, $649, $1,800 are the typical ballpark premiums for practice similar to yours. And here, when a data breach happens, you want to make sure you already have proactive steps. You're prepared for a breach. And here's my contact information. If you want to do some proactive data breach insurance planning, I'd be happy to provide different scenarios of the different insurance companies that we have access to. And please take a look at my website. Larry?
Thank you, Christine. And thank you for attending today. Jim, would you like to close us out?
Certainly. Don't forget the TDA Perks program, hosting its first educational and networking program for office staff tomorrow at the Dallas County Dental Society from 3:30 until 6:30. You'll have complimentary admission and hors d'oeuvres, learn about compliance training, see presentations from Philips Sonicare, Zoom products, and exam gloves. Representatives from the Perks program, Smart Training, Philips Sonicare, and Zoom will all present short programs, and you'll have the opportunity to network with your peers. That is tomorrow from 3:30 until 6:30, the Dallas County Dental Society. Please be there. Our thanks to Christine Marciano for outlining some of the processes and procedures involved in not only mitigating risk, but also preparing to assume it as well. And again, her call information or contact information is on the screen. Please feel free to get in touch with Christine and talk more about data privacy insurance. It's certainly an option that's well worth exploring. Our next webinar is in 2 weeks. We focus on the privacy officer, that role in your practice, and how a privacy officer can prepare himself or herself to deal effectively not only with the threats that Christine has outlined, but with business associate agreements and other long-standing issues having to do with other principles involved in the operation of your practice. So we'll see you again as the curtain rings down on this second installment of our 3-part webinar series. We'll see you again in a couple of weeks. And again, from all of us at Smart Training, thanks for attending.